We're going to be in Matthew 10 this morning. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn there. Otherwise, we'll have them up on the screen up here. Before we get into that, let's pray. Father, we're thankful for the time of worship that we've already shared together this morning. And we ask God that this whole morning, Father, we dedicate it to you. We are here to receive from you and to worship you, God, to give you whatever we are able to give you. And we ask that as we're here this morning, singing and preaching and listening and contemplating, that God, that your Spirit would be with us in a tangible and profound way, God. That God, that you would change us and that you would equip us to continue the work of Jesus on this earth. We ask it in his name. Amen. Amen. So Matthew 10. Now, some of you were here the last time I preached back in June. I was in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 to 7. If you haven't been with us for that long, we've been in a series on Matthew for the last 2 or 3 months. Now, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 to 10, is the first major teaching block that we find in Matthew. And as it turns out, Matthew 10 is the second major teaching in Matthew. Matthew 8 and 9 is basically some stories of Jesus' works of healing, exorcism, things of that nature that seem to be arranged topically. Okay, so this morning, we're in the second major teaching block. And as such, just like we spent a lot of time in the Sermon on the Mount, and we argued that it's of central importance for us today, I think Matthew 10 as the second major teaching block is also of great importance to us. But it's tricky. In some ways, it's a little trickier than the Sermon on the Mount, because it's not obvious how much of it applies to us today. Okay? So what I want to do is I want to start by reading the whole chapter. I think what the Bible says is more profound than what I'm going to say. So I always like to get us rooted by reading it in full. So let's do that together. Matthew 10, starting at verse 1. Jesus called his 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out impure spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Do not go among the Gentiles, or enter any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. As you go, proclaim this message. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. Verse 9. Do not get any gold or silver or copper, or take with you in your belts. No bag for the journey, or extra shirt or sandals or a staff, for the worker is worth his keep. Whatever town or village you enter, search there for some worthy person, and stay at their house until you leave. As you enter the home, give it your greeting. If the home is deserving, let your peace rest on it. If it is not, let your peace return to you. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, leave that home or town and shake the dust off your feet. Truly I tell you, it will be more bearable for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. Verse 16. I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. Be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and be flogged in the synagogues. On my account you will be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to the Gentiles. But when they arrest you, do not worry about what to say or how to say it. At that time you'll be given what to say, for it will not be you speaking, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. You will be hated by everyone because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. When you are persecuted in one place, flee to another. Truly I tell you, you will not finish going through the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Verse 24, the student is not above the teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for students to be like their teachers, and servants like their masters. If the head of the house has been called Beelzebub, how much more the members of his household? So do not be afraid of them, for there is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What I tell you in the dark, speak in the daylight. What is whispered in your ear, proclaim from the roofs. Do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet none of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care. And even the very hairs of your head are not all numbered. So don't be afraid, you are worth more than many sparrows. Verse 32. Whoever acknowledges me before others, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever disowns me before others, I will disown before my Father in heaven. Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household. Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their own son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. Anyone who welcomes you welcomes me, and anyone who welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever welcomes a prophet as a prophet will receive a prophet's reward, and whoever welcomes a righteous person as a righteous person will receive a righteous person's reward. And if anyone gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones who is my disciple, truly I tell you, that person will not lose their reward.
Amen.
All right, long chapter. Hopefully you stayed with it. So what I first want to do is situate this chapter in its historical context. And I think one thing stands out as we do this. This chapter is ultimately about Israel's rejection of her Messiah. Okay? That's what the chapter is ultimately about. If we fail to recognize this, okay, how it relates specifically to Israel in the first century, it is hard to make a whole lot of sense of this chapter. On the one hand, there are passages that we all like to quickly apply, that we've heard. You know, my title itself kind of comes from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, The Cost of Discipleship, right? Famous theologian that lived in Germany during World War II, and he wrote this amazing book called The Cost of Discipleship. And he took a lot of themes in that book from chapters like this, right? So when we hear about taking up your cross and following Jesus, it can be very easy to want to apply these passages quickly. But the problem is, what do we do with some other sections, right? For example, Jesus says not to go into the Gentile or Samaritan towns, but only to the towns of Israel. Does this mean we shouldn't preach to Gentiles? I suspect that most of us in here are Gentiles, right? Jesus says not to take any possessions when they preach the gospel. Does this mean first that we should all be itinerant preachers and that it's wrong for us to take a bag when we go and preach? I suspect that most of us probably have wallets and purses with us. We probably all drove our cars here and have a whole stockpile of goods at our houses. Is this wrong? Jesus says that they can expect to be flogged in the synagogues, right? Not simply flogged, but flogged in the synagogues because of their Christian witness. I doubt very much that anyone's been flogged in the synagogues or is even worried about that this morning. Okay? Then there's this really tricky part, right, which says that the apostles won't finish going through the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Let that sink in, right? What on earth does that mean? I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure the apostles are dead. And I'm equally as sure that Jesus hasn't come. So how do we make sense of that? Have we missed the second coming? Right now, the question is if all of these different issues are indications that we have to understand this chapter first by understanding it in its historical context, then the question for us becomes, well, does it have any relevance to us? And I think it does. I think it has a lot of relevance. But what I want to do this morning is first draw out what I think is kind of the major theme of the chapter in its historical context. And then I'm going to touch on a couple points that I think it powerfully speaks to us today. Okay, so first, what did this mean to the apostles? So, if you were here last week, you should recall that Ward opened his sermon by talking about some of the common Jewish expectations regarding what the Messiah was going to be like when he came. Right? You may remember that he had a picture of the rock up there. And he talked about how many Jews in the first century were expecting a warrior Messiah that was going to come and execute vengeance on the enemies of Israel. In the years leading up to the birth of Jesus, a few hundred years before, Israel had experienced subjugation and oppression at the hands of numerous empires, right? The Persians, the Babylonians, the Medes, the Greeks, and then in the first century, finally, you have Rome. So there's this multiple hundred years of history of the enemies of God subjecting the people of God. And this doesn't make sense. Where is God in all of this? They were waiting for God to act in history and deliver them from their oppressors. One of the texts which played a big role during this time, there's a lot of evidence of this in extra-biblical literature, right? Letters that were written that didn't make it into the Bible. But one of the texts that played a big role is Daniel, specifically chapter 7. Right? And in Daniel chapter 7, a dream is described in which Daniel sees 4 beasts rising up out of the sea. And as the dream progresses, he then sees, quote, one like a son of man, which is basically an Aramaic idiom for a human being. Right? So in contrast to the beast, he sees a human being. And this human being approaches God on the clouds of heaven. So I'm just going to read those verses. So Daniel 7:13. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worship him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Right? So then it goes on to describe the interpretation that Daniel gets for this dream. Verse 15. I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. I approached one of those standing there and asked him the meaning of all this. So he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. The 4 great beasts are 4 kings that will rise from the earth. But the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. Now, there's scholarly dispute over exactly what kingdom is represented by each of the historical beasts. Okay? But what is clear is that each of the beasts, these 4 beasts that come up out of the sea, that they represent these various kingdoms that subjugated Israel. Okay? And that the Son of Man represents corporate Israel and her victory over the 4 beasts. In the first century, right, this text became very popular, and many Jews actually began to interpret this Son of Man figure as a specific Messiah that was going to come, defeat the 4 beasts that rose up in opposition to God, and reclaim the kingdom for God's chosen people. Right? They believed that one like a Son of Man referred to the Messiah who would come and defeat God's enemies. Now, if you know your Gospels, you should recall that one of Jesus' favorite self-designation in the Gospels is this title, the Son of Man. It's one of the most common ways he refers to himself. It appears even in this chapter that we're looking at today, though I'm going to comment on that verse a little later. But as Ward discussed last week, one of the shocking things about Jesus is that he didn't come and conquer the Roman Empire, at least not in the way they were expecting. Rather, he came and died at the hands of those he was supposed, in Jewish minds, to defeat. In Matthew 8 and 9, we see that Jesus is beginning to experience opposition for his message that doesn't comport well with what the Jewish leadership was expecting. So, for example, in the very end of chapter 9, right before we get to the chapter we're looking at today, Jesus drives a demon out of a man at the astonishment of the crowds who are around. This is in 9:33 and 34. Right? The crowds recognize that something unique is going on. When they see what happens, they say, nothing like this has ever happened in Israel. But the Jewish leaders respond in 9:34, it is by the prince of demons that he drives out demons. But clearly Jesus was not aligning with their expectations of what the Messiah was supposed to be, so that even his miraculous works could be dismissed as a work of the devil. Okay, then in chapter 10, we find Jesus teaching his disciples that as they go and labor with him in bringing the gospel throughout Israel, they also can expect the same opposition that he is experiencing. Right? Just as the Jewish establishment at large is rejecting Jesus because his message does not comport with their expectations, they're going to reject the apostles as well. Even while the apostles are given authority to demonstrate the presence of the kingdom by healing the sick and delivering those who are oppressed by demons, they are also going to experience opposition, persecution, and even death at the hands of the Jewish leadership. Now, again, if you know Matthew or if you've been with us through this sermon series, this shouldn't come as a total surprise, because this isn't the first time we see this theme in Matthew, right? Something that Jesus is kind of regularly teaching his apostles. And we saw it, for example, on the previous major discourse in Matthew, right? In the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew 5. Matthew 5, 11 to 12. He says, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad. Great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." In the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Right? So this isn't the first time we see this theme that the apostles are going to be persecuted. In fact, Jesus already told them that they should count themselves blessed. So in chapter 10, Jesus commissions and empowers his apostles. He sends them out to partner with him in declaring the arrival of the kingdom of God. But before he does, he again makes clear what they are going to expect. That this delegation they have, this empowerment they've received, does not mean that they're going to escape suffering. Just as he, their master and teacher, is accused of operating under satanic powers, so they too will be maligned and persecuted. Right? But here's the good news for them. The story of persecution is not the end of the story. Jesus also promises that his vindication and consequently their vindication is also assured. Let's look at verse 23 in a little more detail. Matthew 10:23. "When you are persecuted in one place, flee to another. Truly I tell you, you will not finish going through the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes." This verse describes the vindication of the Son of Man, of Jesus. Now at this point, you may legitimately be asking, how can this verse point to Jesus' vindication? After all, right, the apostles preached throughout Israel, and there is good evidence that many of them were persecuted. Some of them were killed on account of their preaching the gospel. But Jesus didn't seem to come before they were done preaching through Israel. Right? If he had to come, then clearly we could count that as vindication, right? He's returned. Clearly the apostles are counted as right. But the problem is, where is he? Okay, the key to understanding this passage is to understand that Jesus is alluding to the passage in Daniel 7 that we discussed earlier. Recall I stated that a number of Jews in the first century believed that the one like a son of man in Daniel 7 was a reference to the Messiah. It's highly likely that many if not most Jews in the first century would have recognized Jesus' allusion to Daniel 7 when he referred to himself as the Son of Man. Now, when Jesus speaks of coming, our problem today is that we tend to think of this imagery as Jesus coming from heaven to earth. But I want to suggest that this is not how Jews in the first century would have heard this. It may seem strange, but let's think back to where this language comes from in Daniel. Okay, when the Son of Man comes in Daniel, he's coming on the clouds of heaven. It is not a coming to earth. Rather, the passage very clearly states he comes on the clouds of heaven to the throne of God, where he receives the kingdom from God. When Jesus alludes to Daniel 7, he's not referring to his coming to earth, but to his coming on the clouds of heaven to God, where he will receive all authority. The passage, in other words, is not ultimately about Jesus' return to earth, but it is about his resurrection and ascension, where he'll be vindicated by the Father. Now, I'm going to be speaking a lot more on these themes in like 2 months. I know some of you won't be here. That's what it is. But I'll be getting more in depth. But if this sounds strange to you, I want to just touch on one more verse that hopefully drives this point home. Okay? Because I think the problem is we've just grown so accustomed to hearing this coming language and thinking immediately of what Christian doctrine says is the final coming of Christ, that we fail to be able to read this in its most plausible historical context. Okay? But turn to Matthew, if you have your Bible, Matthew 26, 63 to 64. And you'll see the same kind of language appears. Okay, so after Jesus is arrested, he's brought before the Sanhedrin. That's the context of these verses. He's brought before the Jewish leadership, who ask him if he is the Messiah. So just a sentence into verse 63. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Verse 64. "You have said so," Jesus replied. Now listen to this. "But I say to you all, from now on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." From now on. Right? And that is the most plausible interpretation of the Greek phrase which lies under those words. From now on. Representing something that's starting then and going to continue into the future. Now, how is it that from now on, the Son of Man will be sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven, if this somehow speaks to his final return to earth? It makes no sense of the passage. But if this is an allusion to Daniel 7, and rather speaks of Jesus coming on the clouds of heaven to the Father, then what he is saying is that though you are about to put me to death, from now on, I am going to have the authority of the Son of Man described in Daniel. I am going to be on the very throne of God, ruling. Like I said, I'll have a lot more to say about this in Matthew 24 to 25, but hopefully this is beginning to make sense. Okay, now the point of all this, as it relates to chapter 10, is that the suffering that the apostles are assured that they're going to experience is not in vain. God is going to vindicate Jesus and install him as sovereign over all the universe. And consequently, the suffering that awaits the apostles will also be vindicated. Okay, hopefully, I know that's a very quick sketch of a huge section, right? But I think this is ultimately what chapter 10 is about. It is about the suffering that the apostles are going to experience in the first century as they are going about on that delegation of Jesus to spread his message throughout Israel. Right? Jesus was sent first to the Jews, and the apostles are partnering with him. And it is in that context that this chapter begins to make sense as a whole. So the question is, how can we understand these things today? Right? What relevance does this have? Well, I think there's a lot we can get from it, and I just want to tease out a few of the implications. I wrestle about where to go. and I decided to go one direction, and hopefully it's not too controversial, but I think it's relevant. I just say if anybody gets too upset, I'm not on paid staff here, so don't blame it on the church. Just blame it on me. So the first point I want to make is this, and it follows, I think, pretty simply from the chapter. Jesus teaches that those who follow him can expect to suffer. Now, there are many elements of this passage that I've argued that may not directly apply to our situation today, right? As I mentioned, I doubt any of us have experienced flogging in the synagogue, and I'm very confident that none of us will. Most of us, since the time of Constantine at least, in the West, have in fact enjoyed a significant amount of peace. You could even go farther and say that it's arguable that Christians have just as often been the perpetrators of injustice as they have the victims of it. But Jesus' teaching here ought to remind us that as Christians, we ought to be quite at home when we find ourselves apparently disempowered and in a place of suffering. Now, I say apparently disempowered because what is important to remember from this passage is that whatever the legal status or otherwise of Christianity in our culture, the reality is that Jesus is currently on the throne. He has been vindicated. Right? We are not awaiting this. It is a reality. But remember that Jesus' path to vindication was the path of suffering. And we ought not expect any less. The flip side to this is that we ought to be very careful if we find ourselves in positions of power. Recall that the Jewish leadership of the first century failed to recognize their Messiah even though they were thoroughly versed in the scriptures and ended up being instruments of his very persecution. If the Jewish leadership did this, I can assure you we can fall to the same trap today. For the Christian, it is not suffering and persecution that should be our greatest fear, but rather failing to honor God in whatever situation we find ourselves. And if history has taught us anything, it has surely taught us that as Christians, we have often failed to honor God, specifically when we have been in places of power. This ought to frame the way then that we approach all relations of power, whether that be in the family, in the church, in the workplace, or in the public sphere. Christianity is quite at home in suffering. Now here comes a part that could be a little controversial. If it hasn't been already. Hopefully it hasn't been already, otherwise it's going to be a lot worse. Some of you were here when I preached on politics a few months ago, and if you were, then some of this will sound familiar, but I want to be a little more direct today. I recognize and very fast to argue that the right way to vote is not always entirely straightforward, right? There are numerous issues that have to be brought to bear, and Christians can legitimately disagree on those things. However, I do not think that in the church there should be major disagreement on basic Christian convictions. This means that when, for example, our current leader says or does something despicable, we as Christians should be the first to name that as such. The first. Now my fear, or my sense at least, is that as the culture in the United States is becoming more hostile to Christianity, we've been so quick to support anyone that will protect our rights that we have been willing to baptize virtually anything that person says or does. And this is deeply wrong because it destroys our witness. Our greatest concern as Christians should never be whether or not we have political power. The reality is that we have power by virtue of the fact that Christ is currently ruling on the throne, whether or not the nations rage against him.
It's true.
But we must never be willing to sacrifice our Christian identity in order to secure earthly political power. If we do this, we are no longer witnessing to Christ. If our culture turns against Christ to the degree that we are no longer protected as Christians, so be it.
Amen.
Christianity is at home in suffering. This leads me to my next point, which is closely related to the first. Christians can be expected to be maligned as evil. Jesus said that if they call the head of the house Beelzebub, they'll certainly call those in his household the same thing. When I joined the military back in 2006, I often found that even though I was a bit of an oddball because of my conservative Christian views, I was also often respected. Right? I might be picked on a little bit, but it's odd for a 19-year-old that could get into bed with girls to refuse to do so out of principle. Especially in military culture, that's odd. And I often found that people in general respected me for it. 7 years later, when I found myself in grad school, something had changed. Now, admittedly, this could be the difference in location. Certainly, there's a different culture in the military than at most institutes of higher learning. Nevertheless, I think it was also evidence of a shift that was beginning to take place in culture. In grad school, I found that not only was there little respect for conservative Christian views, but my views were actually beginning to put me in a place as someone who's viewed as immoral. And this seems to be something that is happening not only in grad school, but across cultures today, right? It's not just that Christian views, especially on issues like sexuality, are regarded as perhaps overly narrow or backward, but it's beginning to seem that we're being castigated as immoral, as actually morally wrong in the convictions that have been held in the church basically for the last 2,000 years. Now the problem is that especially if you're someone who wants to live a godly life, who wants to follow God in all of the even the difficult ways that entails, right? If you want to live the moral life, the problem with this is that it can be very hard to be castigated as an immoral person. It has enraged me at times, right? There's nothing worse than you're trying to do the right thing and you're maligned as evil in the midst of it. And the pressure then becomes to modify our beliefs in order to appear as godly. And now as this happens, as culture begins to paint us in a certain light, I think there are two ways we can respond that are equally problematic. Right? So the first is legitimately to question whether we have missed it, right? When somebody criticizes us, it is reasonable to sit back and say, okay, did we miss something here? Have we gone astray? Christians are not perfect, and history bears abundance evidence of that. Sometimes we get things wrong, and sometimes it is non-Christians who point that out. And it is good to evaluate whether that is the case. But the problem is in the self-evaluation, sometimes we can succumb simply out of cultural pressure, the idea to seem respectable to culture, to seem like a good person, and not because we actually have gone wrong. And this is one thing we have to be careful of. Right? The impulse for approval is extremely strong among all of us, and we're fools if we deny that. But the opposite extreme is equally as dangerous, right? And the opposite extreme is when we quickly recognize that culture may be calling evil good. But then our solution is to demonize those with whom we disagree and to go to war with them, either figuratively or literally. And yet, in the context of the Gospels, being a faithful witness to Christ requires not only that we may suffer, but as Jesus commanded in the Sermon on the Mount, that we love our enemies. If we are ridiculed as evil, so be it. If they call the head of the house Beelzebub, how much more the members of his household? You can expect it. Again, Christianity is quite at home in suffering. The ushers could come up and the worship team could take place.
Thank you.
I want to say one more thing that I hadn't planned on, but that I think is worthwhile. The reality is there may be some here this morning that are going through it, so to speak. And often in our current context, where we do still enjoy so much freedom, and right, I mean, we live in just a fantastic time in history in terms of the abundance that we have, the freedoms that we have. It's in a lot of ways a great time to be alive in the context of world history. But the reality is that though probably most of us aren't experiencing persecution, awful things still happen. And there may be people here today who are facing death of a loved one, right? Who are about to lose their financial security, who are going through various sorts of mental illness that are just tearing them apart. And a passage like this can seem to offer no hope because the persecution seems to all be external, right? And what happens when life simply happens, right? Is Jesus supposed to deliver us from all this? But I think the same principle of suffering applies to you. Admittedly, in the first century, the biggest threat facing the church was that of outside persecution, and that's not the case today. But what is also evident from the first century is that people were still suffering in other ways. Paul talks about leaving people sick in Miletus, and he talks about crying out to God to be delivered from an affliction which God failed to deliver him from. And the reality is that in whatever place of suffering we find ourselves, I think we can find solace in the fact that Jesus has identified with all of this. And his promise is that he is ruling through it. This may not deliver you from your state of suffering, but be assured that resolution is coming. Hang on. Resolution is coming.